faring well with the current situation at hand. I know it's really brought in a lot of different elements to the forefront of what it means to be doing transit during an emergency. A lot of you have probably had experiences with doing transit during possibly an ice storm, snowstorms, or other minor disruptions, car accidents, other types of transit situations. But it's very interesting coming from California and Florida, where we dealt with fires and floods and hurricanes and earthquakes, and then come here and then a pandemic hits us in 2020. So it really produces another appreciation of what it means to be in the industry and how it is that we react to those situations on a professional level. I've been very impressed as we're watching not only the St. Louis region, but also throughout the United States with what transit has provided that frontline staff as far as their abilities to continue to travel to work and be one of those types of individuals that has the ability to make a difference during such a difficult time. It's hard to bring a topic along with this in de-escalation and the protection of transit operators during a pandemic, because we're all very concerned about how they are in the workplace right now with the current issues that they're stemming with COVID-19. But if we could put that in our thoughts right now and kind of move it to the side, because there is a concern that as when schools have been out of service for quite some time and they're not going back prior to the summer months, and as a lot of individuals have lost their way of supporting their families and job loss, there's the unfortunate aspect that we'll have a very busy summer in transit because of the nature of where we are at with the pandemic. You mixed hot weather, individuals that have lost income, mixed in with kids that haven't been in school for months. And unfortunately, everybody's been cooped up, that the summer can and will produce a very trying time in the world of transit. And I'm trying to get my little slide to move here. There we go. Now, just to make sure, once again, can everybody see my screen? Everybody can see this, the course overview?
Yes.
Okay. So what we're going to cover today, we're going to talk about transit operators and their techniques. We're going to talk about techniques that they currently use versus techniques that we would like for them to use. We're going to talk about verbal and physical cues. We are going to go quite a bit into situational awareness because it plays a very large part in this overall course. We're going to talk about different agency policies, procedures that coincide with fare disputes and other issues that we have around the fare box. And we're going to discuss any relevant state laws and regulations that are in place that may be underutilized at this current point. At the end, we'd like to be able to talk about conflict and de-escalation in a way that helps describe and also brings information to you that you could take to the operators, that you could take to the bargaining units, that you could take to your supervisors, and talk a little bit more about this word, because as we know, one of the difficult points in delivering transit service has become the issue of conflict and de-escalation. We also want to talk about some of the issues that causes the passenger frustration to increase instead of reduce while that conflict is in play. We're going to demonstrate some techniques of diffusing the situation, and then also, again, talk about some of the different types of laws that surround this. So let's talk a little bit about who your customers are. Let's talk about the differences between the north, south, east, and west in the world of conducting transit. Are customers different in the lines of service, and what's unique about your customers? So I know we have a wide variety of folks on this presentation today, but think for a second to yourself, who are your customers? Now, for a lot of you, you may have had experiences within the state, within the county, or within other locations that you previously possibly had transit service experience. I always ask this question, because people say, well, the transit ridership in New Jersey is different than the transit ridership in Florida, which is different than the ridership in Dallas. Now, there are some nuances to that as far as how aggressive and how people communicate. But the type of customers that ride the service lines have one thing in common, and that is because they are transit, pro-transit, whether they're transit dependent or whether they're part of your choice ridership. So we have all types of customers, but typically their main course for using transit is the same. What about the transit users in the north and south? Same thing. What about customers that use various lines of service? Now, we all know that rail transit and bus lines and paratransit type services do have a different type of ridership that come in. Do they treat their riders different? Do the operators treat their clients different? We notice now in rail lines, there's simply just a lot of under interaction with the transit ridership. However, when you go into paratransit services and into bus line services, there's considerable opportunities for interaction. That's why we see a lot of issues on a platform in rail or possibly in the line, but not so much like what we have in the bus, which is usually surrounded around the fare box in the driver area. What's unique about the different types of ridership that you have in your locations that might not be necessarily the same somewhere else? Can anyone throw me an example of how your ridership would be more or less unique from the other types of ridership that we have? We have anybody out there that can throw something on the table for us?
Well, for us at Oates, we deal with rural, urban, and even less rural in the state of Missouri, since we're in 87 counties. So it just depends on what part of the state it's in. It's just different all over for us.
Okay, very good. Now, when you say rural, John, give us an idea of what that could entail to pick up one client that's in a rural area.
Well, I have actually scouted one of our routes, and it went from being on a 2-lane concrete highway, going to a asphalt road, to a gravel road, to a small trail to get this person.
What's interesting for you, John, and I'm sure your team, there is the propensity of even having your vehicle get stuck from time to time.
Stuck, going down a long driveway, can't find a way to turn that big bus around, having to back down that long driveway, and the only telephone pole that's on that road, our bus seems to hit.
Yes. Yes, very, very unique in that situation. I think
very
everybody can appreciate that.
Steve, it's very challenging, believe me, when it comes to picking up some of our customers. You know, the footprints of our vehicles have gotten larger, and it doesn't help when you have to go down certain roads, certain places, and that bus is too big to go down.
Correct.
It's just really in some situations very difficult.
And very unique at that. Now, have any of you had an experience with working on either the far east or the far west coast in the world of transit? Do we have anybody out there today that used to work out on this, you know, near New York and up and down the East Coast, or somewhere out in California, maybe up to Sound Transit? Far east, far west, anybody on this call? Well, I could tell you that there's a lot of transition in the types of customers that also utilize those services, and how they depend on transit in their view is a lot different than how, and when I went to Florida from California, how they treated transit in California was certainly not how they viewed the practice in Florida. Has anybody experienced that, about the uniqueness of doing transit in the Midwest versus on the far east, the far west? Has anybody experienced anything regarding that? Well, the mindset is very, very different. And sometimes the word aggressive comes to mind. But unfortunately, we're dealing with a lot of different aspects in our ridership these days. As much as transit has changed over the years, our ridership has equally changed. So there's a lot of different items that we need to discuss regarding that. So the basic desires of our transit customer: reliability, safety and security, conveniences. They want it to be clean and comfortable, simple, affordable, and friendly. Now, when you think about your transit service, these are basically in an order that makes sense. Recently conducted a study on where people rate these types of issues when they want to consider riding transit or when they ride transit if they're transit dependent. Now, for a lot of people, you notice that number one is typically reliability. And we know the stresses that come out when there's a service change and then you're finding other locations for bus stops and for your lines to go and not go. And a lot of times they're based heavily on political decisions and then also funding decisions. But the number one issue typically comes up is reliability. However, one that matches that fairly regularly now that it did not in the past was safety and security. If you go back over a decade or so, safety and security always was in the top 5, but it was very rarely towards the top. However, in the last 5 years especially, safety and security has become basically equal to, if not more than, depending on the system, number one. And as you can imagine, someone from myself who did this type of work out west and then down south, and then you come to the Midwest, I see a lot of similarities, but I also see a lot of heightened areas that need a lot of attention. And a lot of that has to do with the mindset that we have to instill with the employees that we bring into our stead. Now, of course, these other items: clean, simple, affordable, friendly. You notice that friendly is on there, and have an empathy. Ridership typically will respond in a way that the operator also gives response. And as you know, which I'm sure many of you have witnessed either firsthand or watched videos of how drivers sometimes maintain a very positive and friendly atmosphere, and we have other operators that do not. And unfortunately, instead of de-escalation, they escalate the situation. Making the first impression. Notice in this photograph here, you're looking at a friendly face, you have a smile. The operators actually turn their body, well, it looks like their seatbelt's not even on. However, the demeanor, the mannerism, you notice that. Did anyone else notice that the seatbelt was basically off to the side? You know, everyone has one of those operators or a whole class of operators that greets passengers, that gives them at least a smile, a good morning, a good afternoon. The way we present ourselves is typically the way that we will get some of the information back, whether it's just a gesture, a head nod, a blink, a smile. It doesn't matter, but it is a good place to start. And what I want to ask, how can the satisfied customer have a positive effect on the operator? Anyone? How can the customer have an effect on the operator?
If they come on the bus friendly.
Absolutely. Whether they come on pre-charged or not, whether they had a good day or a bad day, whether they missed the first line and are catching the second line. All these different things come out on what type of day. It's no different than how sometimes folks go in to get a haircut or maybe go in afternoon and they're getting lunch and the server has a smile or a grim look on their face. So if a satisfied customer is having a good effect on the operator, it increases satisfaction. It makes for a pleasant working environment, does it not? However, what we're seeing consistently out there these days is that for every couple of these, we have maybe 5 or 10 that may have a different paradigm. And that's very difficult when you're dealing with hundreds, if not thousands of passengers throughout the day. For the customer, you have a loyal rider. How many of you have noticed that on a bus line, your regulars are the ones that help regulate the on-time performance? They help regulate how the operator gets to conduct their business. They get to regulate how the others are behaving on your line. Those regular riders really help the overall system effective. Transit agency, long-term customer loyalty, increased ridership. That's a word we'd all like to hear right now with the looming, drop in ridership from anywhere from 50% to 95%, depending on the location of your system and how your system has reacted to the COVID. But in that absence, this is a huge part of your transit-dependent ridership. They do care about how they're treated on their line. How can an angry or unsatisfied client have a negative effect on your operator? Well, that's what we're primarily here today to discuss. Creating the conflict and the negative impact. How many of you experience operator burnout? How many of you experience operators that are having negative effects on their health? How many of you noticed that, unfortunately, we've had a lot of operators over the years gain weight or look physically and emotionally stressed and drained? And we're trying to encourage them in a career such as being a bus operator or another type of mode operator on how to maintain physical awareness and be healthy. So they have another day to come back, another day to come back. It's not a very good time when you have buses or other vehicles being pulled from service because the seat that they sit in is unfortunately wet. And it happens because of restroom access, but it also happens due to physical aspects of what it means to be under stress. For the client, there's a loss of reliable transportation. There's frustration when we have difficulty making our service because of a lack of operators to get behind the wheel. And for the transit agency, it increases our customer complaints and negative reputation. It's very difficult to handle, but it starts with your frontline employees. So why are transit workers at the increased risk for workplace violence? Well, they work alone. They're in direct contact with the public. Their workplace is mobile, so we know what that means when they call in to radio dispatch, how difficult it is to have a vehicle that was still in movement. They work in a variety of settings. It could be rural, it could be urban, it could be in the suburbs, it could be at night, it could be early in the morning, and during inclement weather. One, you're also dealing with the delivery of passengers. On buses, you're still handling fares, and of course, you are working at night. Everybody familiar with the Transit Cooperative Research Program? I'm assuming, yes, that we've all used some types of synthesis or interaction with them. So they surveyed 66 agencies. Most occurs evening, late night, early morning. So there is a definite decrease during midday, essentially because children are supposed to be at, our teenagers are supposed to be at school and everyone else should be at work. Verbal assaults, most common reported forms of assault, followed by spitting, then projectiles. Fare enforcement, alcohol, and drugs are common factors during an assault. Anyone have another example of where they feel that maybe there's one more in here that needs to be discussed? Fare enforcement, alcohol. What about mental health? What about mental health these days?
That's one of the things that we have a lot of is we have some passengers that have their mental capacity is what causes a lot of our disagreements or their outburst on the bus. And fortunately, we have a lot of our drivers that have transported these people for many months or many years, and they know how to handle them to get them back under control.
Yeah, we do definitely find, John, that in the paratransit world, that the way that those operators handle themselves during the situations are usually pretty stable. where we do run into trouble is that we experience more turnover in the bus operator line, and that we have more new drivers basically coming into the system. And there is a lack of understanding and probably training in how the mental health community and how some of that ridership affects the operators and that relationship that they have between the two. So it's interesting. One of those items that we'll probably talk about at some point today is we will need to talk about training, and we will need to talk about the mental health side of our job as it continues to grow. Okay, assault in the news. Angry passenger assaulted operator being told they would need to wait and to board. Operator assaulted in street after colliding with an auto. 2 women assault operator after arguing over fare. Intoxicated man spit on and physically assaulted the operator after being nudged awake. These are just a very small number of assaults that are in the news. I know that there's many, many, many more that include knives, that include guns, that include being punched in the face without any warning. Before I relocated to St. Louis, I was involved with the unfortunate incident that happened in Tampa on the Heartline, whereas the operator was unfortunately killed by knife across their throat at 30 miles an hour with riders. It happened last spring. And then the same year later, another operator was assaulted with a box cutter. And they were in the hospital for weeks because of their arms, excuse me, and their legs were severely cut. And so we do not know at the end of the day the extent at which a human can take another human during their normal workplace and abuse them in that level. But of course, in this course, we are also going to talk about being defensive in appropriate ways, but also driver barriers that there's been a lot of discussion about over the last couple of years. Conflict.
Stephen,
Yes, sir.
can I ask a quick question?
Absolutely.
I noticed on the last slide there are they're both men and women that end up with conflict and sometimes assaults on operators. Is there
Correct.
a breakdown on those stats? Just something that occurred to me about trying to see where we typically have issues and how that breaks out.
Yeah, so what we're experiencing is that we've had increases every year for 10 years. I'm going to give you the unfortunate side of it. The number has not subsided. The number of females involved in assaults has dramatically increased over those 10 years. And unfortunately, the average age of the typical assault has gone down, meaning we have more and more folks that are anywhere between the age of 14 and maybe early 20s. That number continues to rise. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it certainly fits with, I think, our experience. I was just curious about how it was working out in other systems.
Very unfortunate news, but we have not seen a plateau in the amount of assaults. Not only, and that's national, by the way. That is absolutely a national figure. Of course, the larger metros and in certain locations experience a brunt of them, whether you're in the the greater Chicago area all the way to the East Coast, up and down the East Coast, out to California, the DART system, Houston. There is more information being shared as to how some of the systems are actively growing, but may see also a downtick or a little bit of a leveling on their particular properties. But sometimes that has a lot to do also with their funding models and what they're able to do in their training and equipment programs and their capital programs. Something that maybe we could talk a little bit about towards the end of this, because it could get a little confusing at this point. but there are some programs and some equipment out there that really enhances the ability to reduce the assaults. And I'm not talking about just the operator barriers, but there's a lot of new other training programs and camera systems. Do any of you have camera systems that allow you to remote into the vehicle that you're filming? Anyone on this call have that capability? No. Yeah, see, some of the higher end systems have that capability, and they have the ability to identify those individuals that are being involved. And the way that they run their security system also allows them to respond in a way that has been fairly effective. But maybe we'll talk about that here in a little bit. So let's talk about conflicts. When we talk about this, we usually think of client-on-client conflict that occurs within the vehicle, whether it's a paravehicle, a bus, or LRV or whatnot, doesn't matter, client-on-client. But then the one thing that I'm sure most of you are listening on this particular program is when it's the client and the operator, and when it's the operator on the client. I used to go to every single property in the state of Florida. So there's 300 transit agencies in the state of Florida, whether they're 53.7, 53.10, 53.11, but we would go to 100 properties a year and inspect all these different aspects. And when I pulled the video, or when I was allowed to watch the video, or when I watched them when I was investigating at Central Florida, what would you say I most commonly saw with an operator and a client who had conflict? What would you say I typically saw during that conflict? Let's say out of 10 times, out of 10 videos that I watched, what do you think I saw that was more common?
Operator on client?
Yes, unfortunately. What we typically saw was the inability for the operator to disconnect from that conflict, to use any type of resolve or de-escalation skills. They take it very personal when they're possibly called names, or when it comes to being physically located in the box and that bus becomes theirs. They take immediate ownership of that. And the de-escalation phase never started. And so there is an escalation phase that would determine whether it became physical, or it was just verbal, or whether they properly followed their own process and procedures to also possibly de-escalate. Now, many of you have probably seen it escalate to the level to where next thing you know is you have your bus parked on the side of the road on a busy road, and your operator and the client are in a fist fight out next to the door. And I've seen it carry on all the way to the front of the bus, to the back of the bus, to where people have been thrown over the fare box, into the windshield, and to where then it also engaged ridership. And this is exactly what we're trying to avoid. And this is why this course is very important, because we're going to talk a lot about the de-escalation phase and how we can get there as fast as possible. So let's talk about the common areas of conflict for us in the transit world right now. Spitting, attitude, profanity, fare disputes, delays, poor hygiene, supervisor conflict. Now, I want to start with the bottom one, with supervisor conflict. Why do you think that's even on there? As you know, a lot of operators report that they have a poor relationship with their supervisory staff. As we know, a lot of the supervisors in transit were formerly operators. And so what happens is, as they promote, usually there is a lack of training that becomes part of the supervisor onboarding process. They may have on-the-job training. They may experience a little bit of time with someone that might mentor them, or maybe you have a day or a two course. However, what supervisors typically report is that there is not a formal supervisor training program that they get involved with once they get promoted. Operators will routinely report that they are poorly treated by the supervisor, that they are docked down to by the supervisor, and that when it comes to conflict, that it's not de-escalated, it actually is escalated. We had reports of supervisors pulling buses over like law enforcement, blocking the front of the bus off, coming into the bus to talk to the operator and yelling and screaming and to the operator in front of the passengers. And that supervisor conflict and their skills are not necessarily any better than what the drivers have received in the same area. So there is a complete lack of training typically in the supervisory area. We've done a lot of work on that because, as you know, when everybody works, 8 to 5, transit is possibly working 23 hours a day, and you need to rely on your mid-management to run the service at an appropriate level. Poor hygiene. This comes, in fact, on both sides, but in the rider or from the driver's perspective, some of them show up, unfortunately, not well rested, not well groomed. They have food on their shirts. They have holes in their uniform. Their hair's not properly combed, and things of that nature. And that deals over. But it also goes over to the ridership. As we know, ridership comes in all shapes and forms and sizes, and they also come on with poor hygiene. So it goes two ways. Delays in service. How many of you are experiencing delays in service just due to traffic? Traffic is going on highs and lows. Right now it's on a low, but typically during traffic, we know it's very difficult to keep on-time performance, especially where there's a heavy construction. Fare disputes should always be at the very top. These are not in order. Fare dispute, definitely. The fare box is one of those difficult situations if they work fixed route. That continues to be an issue. As you know, across the United States, there's systems that are toying with the idea or have already implemented a no fare policy, where they're going to try to absorb the fare box revenue and see if they can absorb it, which could allude to another safety and security issue of then your overall ridership and how many you'll have on service lines and the security of the passengers because there's no fare. So it goes hand in hand. Yet there's a lot of studies out there. The top three are the ones that are most easily consumed by the operator. The spitting is immediate. That is one of the worst offenses reported by operators. A lot of them, and you may have heard this, have reported they'd rather be punched in the face than spit in the face. That's a hard one to understand because a lot of us may have never had anyone spit in our face before. But for a lot of the men, especially, they've clearly reported in surveys that they'd rather be punched. And then, of course, with the attitude and profanity prevailing these days, it's very difficult for them to always remain calm. So these are the types of issues that we'll use in a lot of our examples as we move forward. Any questions from anybody so far? Everybody's good? All right, let's talk about the triggering of events. Let's talk about perception. A fear-inducing event where the individual feels threatened or is about to lose something of value versus a frustrating event. You can see that we produce two different types here. The frustrating event is your attitudes, your vulgar behavior, your bad language. These are the types of ones that will receive the increase over time where the operator does not necessarily have the skills sometimes to de-escalate from this event. Operators need to have the training to understand how to de-escalate, which we're going to cover here very shortly. The fear-inducing event is different. That's if someone comes in, veins out of their forehead, clenched fists. This is the carotid's coming out. They're sweating. Their pupils are either dilated or restricted, and they're obviously in duress. Now, we watched a lot of videos, thousands of videos, where we had a client standing next to the operator with all these signs: sweating, profusely aggravated, excuse me, and the operator did not understand or did not pay attention to the situation that was possibly about to occur. They did not have what we call situational awareness to understand why that was going to be an issue, and which is very daunting when you think about it, because as you know, these days, the possibility of assault is higher than ever. So what is de-escalation? It's when you're using your communication skills to calm a person who's angry or out of control or disturbed. If you take proper charge of the situation, it reduces the possibility for violence. Many of you have the ability to watch, review video, correct? Do you all have the capabilities more or less? Yes. So
Yes.
when you watch these videos, what are some of the things that you notice the most that they miss out on, these cues, right? During this de-escalation phase, where it's just a talking point, if someone comes in and says, you're late, now I'm late, you're always late, and they get a big old attitude with the operator, and instead of just paying their fare and walking off, they stand there and they wait for a response from the operator. You can probably count this on hundreds of times on how many this will occur. Or, I don't have the fare. Can I ask the ridership if they have the fare so I can pay my fare? And then everybody's yelling in the back of the bus saying, let's go, I'm late, I need to get to work. And then we have another issue. Are operators currently trained at any high level to handle those situations? During a training program, like a lot of training programs for a fixed route are anywhere from 6 weeks to approximately 8 or 9 weeks. When we would look at the curriculum for that, most of the training consumption was on the road training. Why? Because they have to learn their routes. And so they do on the road training. They're with a mentor or with a line instructor, and the vast majority of that time is over the road. And it's not in service necessarily either in the beginning with the operators and the trainers. The last couple of weeks might be in service, but then you have 2 operators on the vehicle. What happens to the classroom time when you have the ability to possibly cover something under this type of curriculum, whether it's 2 hours, 4 hours, 8 hours? How in depth does the current curriculum cover situational awareness and de-escalation for drivers and driver safety? So it's very interesting. When we used to travel around and look at driver's education, the initial onboarding training was usually, if it covered it, it was too short at all. And usually it didn't cover this type of information. And if the driver was in an assault or being trained on assault, the information was not conducive to what really would happen. I'm sure most of you encourage operators to not get out of their seat. However, when they get aggravated, what is one of the first things they do? And when they get out of their seat is usually when it all breaks down. Trigger event. So you have the trigger event. Let's just say again, it's the angry client gets on, you're late, you're always late, I'm not paying fare, you're just always late, you're the problem, nothing else. Triggering event. Then you have conflict right here. Now there's an area in between here, which is the escalation phase. This is where we need to work with our operators. The triggering event, they're always going to happen. The conflict could possibly happen, but it's based off your escalation phase and what we want the operators to handle it in a certain fashion and be trained in a certain fashion. This is where we want to focus a lot of our attention. This is where the operators, and everybody understands this, uses the fight or the flight. Now, when we suggest flight, the flight is more of what we like to consider the de-escalation phase. The fight is the escalation phase. That means human nature kicks in, our heart increases, endorphins come out, we get a lot of dump into our body saying, hey, you need to defend yourself. Well, you can't just train this and think that people are going to understand how to use it. You actually have to physically train in this course to create this physical response. And it's very difficult because the only ones that really do this are police, fire, EMS, military, and these are skills that are physically trained, not just discussed. So you see right here, you know, where it is, I'm going to stand up and I'm going to, you know, punch him back in the face, or I'm going to take off. Now, during this acute stress, your body releases all this stuff. And this is where a lot of folks struggle, because if they're a very calm person for the most part, and then you get a dump of adrenaline, you want to burst into mode. Your heart rate goes up, your breath, your blood pressure, you don't hear. You're physically tuned in from what you see, but you don't hear very well anymore. And it's very difficult to train on this particular item. But you can, and you should. That's why they created the Red Man outfit. Everybody understand what a Red Man outfit is? Basically, they use it with police dogs and other types of physical training. That's why they developed the Red Man uniform, was so you can go and physically understand what it means to possibly have an assault occur to you and how to defend yourself within reason, within your bargaining unit agreement, within your own scope of policy and procedures that your agency has, and what's supported by your local law enforcement and your state prosecution office. Because how many times have you probably heard, hey boss, you know, what do I do if an operator, if a rider comes up and you know, flinches at me and then throws a punch? If they throw a punch and let's say they miss me, boss, what can I do? And a lot of people,
victim.
Go ahead.
Be a good victim.
Be a good victim. Well, explain that a little bit, John. What is a good victim?
Well, Steve, I'm a retired law enforcement officer. Spent 24 years as a cop, both military and civilian. And one of the things that when I talk to certain drivers about certain problems is to keep calm and be a good victim. And what I mean by that is don't provoke that person to do more to you. You know, if you're doing everything possible to keep that person calm and cool, you're going to win, you know. And I always tell them, if a person starts yelling at you, if you yell back, you've already lost that argument because you fall right into what they want you to do. So I always tell them to be a good victim, keep your hands to where they can be seen. And if a person tries to make you do something that you shouldn't, you know, the best thing to do is not to react to it.
Well, I certainly like that and can appreciate it. Let's take it to the next level, to where we're in fixed route on a certain line in a very difficult part of town, and where the rider, unfortunately, is taking advantage of the situation and did punch the operator in the face and continues to assault the operator. Let's talk about the more difficult side of that situation, which is more common again in fixed route, obviously, and it does occur. So John, let's talk a little bit about that, where the first punch
does most of those vehicles, I understand that, you know, a lot of the vehicles that we buy have panic buttons on them, and if they're close to the regional office, that panic button goes off. The regional office is contacting that operator to see what's going on this vehicle. And it's I think personally in your position, in St. Louis, your buses are probably equipped with that panic button to let them know that there's a problem going on that bus.
Well, let's continue on this line, and this is why this is so very important. Depending on the type of operator and how they've been trained, they may or may not have hit the panic button. They may or may not have notified operations control. I've seen a lot of it go both ways, where unfortunately, once the stress has occurred, they no longer remember. Their brain, the way they're thinking is no longer occurring like that. And at this point, you have what we call a physical assault going on. And this does happen, and unfortunately on certain lines, that could include more than just fists. That could certainly include other types of devices, unfortunately.
Right.
And so, you know, yes, John, you're correct. There's certain levels of what the different types of situations call for. But as we escalate into certain events, and how many events that we have experienced on our bus line here in St. Louis, the operators are more quick and adept to want to talk about the physical side of the assault and what they could do about it versus, you know, maybe someone just giving them a bad day, you know, saying some bad words to them.
Well, unfortunately, the type of vehicles that you have, your drivers is placed at a disadvantage in your area. Unfortunately for us, our drivers have a driver's door that they can get out if that situation occurs. They don't have to go through the passenger entrance to get out of the vehicle, versus where you guys, you get off the same way the passengers do. That driver has no other outlet but to have to fight his way to get away from that passenger by trying to get to that exit.
Absolutely.
Where our drivers are in many buses that are a combination of a Ford E450, E350 cab with a bus back to the back of the cab, which gives them a driver's door that if that situation ever occurs, they can open that door and get out and take their cell phone with them and call 911.
Absolutely.
Where your driver doesn't have that advantage.
Yes, yes. That's why there's a lot of thought-provoking issues that come up, and a lot of it does deal with, again, bus operator and the ridership issue, and why the heightened awareness is that we've had some serious, very serious incidences of brandishing and the use of knife and guns, more throwing projectiles, the spitting, and of course being assaulted by being punched, kicked, and then ganged up upon. So we're going to look at it from a wide angle, and then I'll allow people jump in when they want to zoom in on certain areas. But I can tell you, for the bus operators that work fixed route in a very in a metro area and very difficult parts of the area, when they talk about assault, they're usually talking about from a minimum of a spitting all the way up to being punched, kicked, and otherwise to that event. So we will cover a wide variety of those types of issues. So how does that work with our operators continuing to come to work day in and day out? You know, leading to stress. As we know, our bus operator attendance has definitely taken a turn over the years, and some of that has to do with stress, and then also their physical abilities as they've been in their job year over year over year. You could tell some operators have handled the stress effectively, and you probably know who those drivers are within your rank and file. And you have other drivers who have a performance jacket that is about this thick, you know, and then on top of that, there's other health issues that come in play with the effects of stress. And it's very important that there's a way for that stress to be dealt with day in and day out. There should be programs more than just the programs that are typically provided through your emotional health programs and the other programs offered through the Human Resources Department. This should actually be a regular routine opportunity for your frontline workers to go in and reduce their stress by talking about their concerns. So we all know that there's, you know, there's break rooms, and a lot of transit agencies have been real good about providing exercise and exercise rooms, but that's what transit does on their property, and that is wonderful. We also need to encourage them to do active stress reduction outside of work. A lot of folks in our industry go and then work a second job, and that is a major concern because they'll work 8 to 10 hours here depending on their splits and all this. then they go work at the airport or somewhere else and they pick up another 6+ hours. And even though we have an hour of service, an in-house hour of service regulation here, you don't really know how many hours they may claim a second employment for moonlighting purposes, but we really don't know how many hours that they're in service outside of that. Now, in many other states, the hours of service is in administrative code at the state level, meaning if they go and they hold a CDL, so this is just for the CDL drivers, if they hold a CDL, there is an hours of service maximum that they can absolutely hit if they work at their primary job and then go drive again after that job. We found that a lot of accidents that occurred on the systems was because the operators were working simply too many hours. And so that was one of those items that we put into the safety program, is to ensure that the hours of service is being met. The reason why we bring that up is because instead of going home and maybe exercising or taking a break and enjoying things, they're working, okay, or doing other things that isn't necessarily any of these items. So we highly encourage additional interaction at that level. So stress affects your de-escalation techniques. Stress can throw out basically all your de-escalation techniques if they have any. Stress could be felt by others in the workplace, and understanding how the stress happens. A lot of folks that you've been around, I'm sure, in the transit agency and law enforcement military, you know pretty quick whether your stressful situation is going to spiral out of control. There you have a gut instinct that will tell you when this is about to go. Recognizing and having the techniques and enacting those techniques is what we're talking about. Is what we're saying, time out, deep breath, don't react to that. Let's take that next step. It's that gray area that I was telling you about in the middle. It could either escalate or de-escalate. All right, so here's a scenario. Passenger boards, just like I was stating earlier, you're late, you're always late. We have 3 types of operators. One operator is gonna say, you know, we unfortunately hit a lot of traffic. We're running a little bit behind. I'm gonna try to do my best to get us back in line. You know, I appreciate your concern. I'll do everything I can to help resolve it. Driver number 2 just stares at them and says, sit down. The sooner you sit down, the quicker we're gonna take off. Operator in the other third, well, you're not helping this situation. In fact, you know, what are you gonna do about it? You know, so you have these types of things. I'm really washing it down to a minimal, but that's what we have. What do we have in regards to the self-control? Why did operator 1 handle it one way, operator 2 handle it one way, operator 3 handle it a different way? There's a lot of confusion in being proactive versus reactive. Proactive is driver number 1. Hey, I understand. We're all feeling the pain. We're trying our best to make up for it. In fact, our BOCC just called in. They're going to send out a plug bus to make sure that we can kind of get back on time. And we're going to do all these efforts to make sure that we minimize this. Versus the reactive response, which is basically operator 2 and operator 3. The proactive response, we need to focus on eliminating those problems. And again, how many of you and how many driver programs have a process built in of being proactive in eliminating the problems? You're actually physically practicing these role plays. You're discussing these out, whether you go out in the lot and put someone behind the wheel, or whether you're in a classroom proactively putting this into the program. This has to be trained. All of you that have been in the service or other types of programs where you're heavily trained on the onset, there's a reason for that. And then it's practice on a yearly basis during your in-service training to reinforce the skill. Because if it's one of those situations, if you don't use it, you lose it. This physically has to be trained on the onset and then at least annually. All right, many experiences with the operator engaging the door and getting the client stuck in the door. I've seen this to an extent where the driver did it on purpose and then drove off. And they did this for about 30 feet, got the vehicle up to almost I'd say 15 miles an hour, until this person fell down and got caught underneath the front wheel. All because the operator was tired of this client. Now, obviously, they didn't know how fast they were going. They don't realize how fast 15 miles an hour is to a human. But obviously, humans don't typically run that fast. I've also seen it where they did it and the person didn't get hurt. And then they opened the door to let the person's arm out. And then what do you think the person did? They jumped into the bus and pummeled the operator. And the bus was still in drive. So then the bus drove into the back of a car in front of them. So I've seen all different levels of accidents, from unfortunately not handling just a scenario that could have been avoided that got escalated. All right, so let's go this one here. A frustrated rider looking for directions or connection information. This should be fairly routine. This should be something that should be a routine in practice and discussed. You'll notice that down here, we try to understand what this person is communicating, but the same thing is using I statements, open-end questions, paraphrasing, letting them vent. Do we, again, train on these situations with our operators to understand that it's okay to take a little bit of time to get to understand what this individual is saying? Down south, we experienced a lot of folks that were from out of the country. So they were from England, they were from Haiti, they were from Cuba, Puerto Rico, all over the world that would come in and ask lots of questions. I assure you that their transit systems were more in depth than what they're experiencing in Florida. And so I always say, what if you or your parents were the one traveling to this system? How would you make them feel? And that's a common one that we would use. All right, passenger, three-wheeled mobility device, which mobility devices continue to change in this day and age. They insist on their method of securement rather than your typical procedure. I'm sure, John, you could probably jump in on that one.
We have a policy that deals with securement of wheelchairs, and so every wheelchair passenger is secured the same way. So, and the reason why we can do that is because we make everybody on the entire bus wear seatbelts.
Do you use a 3 or 4 strap system?
We use a 4-strap system. Actually, we have what is called a 6-point system that we use, where the wheels are secured. Well, the frame of the wheelchair is secured, and then the seat belt, lap belt, different things like that to keep that rider in place while the vehicle's in motion. Okay, and here's an interesting contrast with this, John. I know I must have some fixed route folks on the call. Can I have someone from fixed route describe a little bit about their ADA securement and why it's so much different from this perspective on the points contact and maybe on your policy? Can anyone share just a little bit of a variance on that?
Here at City Utilities, we have both 4-point and 3-point systems. The 3-point our drivers like because there's less contact. The 4th point of contact comes to the wall on that Q strength system. And then for us, because the fixed route system doesn't have seatbelts for all the drivers, our policy is we are to offer any wheelchair passenger the seatbelt restraint, but we don't require them to wear them because the rest of the bus doesn't have to wear them.
That's correct. So if they refuse that seatbelt, is that called into your dispatch?
No, we just make sure that that question was asked of the passenger, and then if we have any issues, we'll pull the video.
Yeah, I noticed with that. This is Matthew speaking, correct?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I noticed with that where a lot of agencies did exactly what you're talking about. And I found that some of them ended up doing the call in as well. And I'm not exactly sure how that came into effect other than to make sure that there was the question being asked by the operator. And sometimes their video was not picking up enough of the information to confirm or deny whether that rider acknowledged in some fashion. But I'm sure what you've experienced in fixed route is that a client can and will fall out of the wheelchair.
Absolutely, and that happens within the recorded time that's held on that hard drive. We always know within that hard drive, and right now our hard drives are holding twice as much video as we're used to because of curtailed rides. But yeah, it works out well for us.
Okay, very good. And if you have a non-traditional scooter come in, let's say it's a three-wheeled, so one wheel in the front, two wheels in the back, and unfortunately now manufacturers, they can make them a little bit taller than not. Have you had any better success with the operator and their engagement with the client on how that works out?
No, it's really not much different. The three-wheel, we have one three-wheel scooter I can think of on our system right now. The passenger actually rides it in, stands up, picks the thing up, and turns it around, and then backs it into space. And but it straps in basically the same. We strap it as low as we possibly can, and we practically beg the rider to take the seatbelt because it is so top heavy.
Yes, understood.
Very much so.
My last question to everybody, and I'm sure you have a policy and procedure on this. However, this is something that I do see when watching video from across the world, is a client that does not meet your lift or ramp, or more so your lift load rating, and then unfortunately may or may not fit in between your aisle width. And I've seen some unfortunate conflicts occur, and very poorly handled, by the way, on those that did not meet that very unique requirement. Anyone else have an experience that it fully falls into this in de-escalation? Because the way I saw it handled is very sensitive and difficult, but these are the types of things that you have to share with the operators during the onboarding process, because if you don't share with them how to do it and you leave it up to them and they're not sure, unfortunately, it might not be the proper outcome. So has anybody had someone that did not meet the limit for your ramp or your lift or your aisle width?
Actually, a lot of our buses, Steve, we have a special section in the bus for wheelchairs. So they don't make it that far to go down the aisle. So basically, when they get on the bus, the lift is to the rear of the bus. They come into the rear of the bus, and then that way they go into the wheelchair section of the bus. We've had in some past instances where the weight limit of the rider and the wheelchair are too heavy for the lift. So what I've heard in some of these situations is that they let the rider get off the wheelchair, go up the lift by himself, and then they bring the wheelchair on after that to get the rider onto the bus. So
Okay.
it's done separately.
Well, and that's, John, see, this is very important, because there's a differentiation between what a para vehicle is built for and has for capacity versus what a fixed route vehicle does.
And see, we're not on a time constraint a lot of times when we have to do this, Steve. We're not in a rush. So a lot of times, this is the only passengers that we're picking up is this particular client to take where he needs to go. So it's not like we got to stop and pick up you. We got to pick up, Mark, or pick up whoever. We're picking up this passenger and this passenger alone. So we don't have the time constraints like the fixed route drivers do.
Yeah, the fixed route drivers can be put in a lot of stress. One, because they are under the time constraint. Two, they may not be completely clear on their policy or procedure in this situation. And then when they try to do the right thing and they do bring the client up, and then there's a possible pinch point as they turn left to go down, depending if it's a low floor, high floor, and all this stuff. It's stressful and it's embarrassing, not only for the client, but also for the operator. And we've seen a lot of oddball situations occur, and unfortunately some escalated events. So I'm just encouraging you more on the fixed route side to consider these different types of situations, and don't forego training on them, because again, what we found is that the operator will fill in the blanks on their own if you don't. All right, so does anyone have a particular desire to talk about comfort pets, different types of pets, you know, cats, dogs, chickens, monkeys, iguanas, you name it, we've seen it all. And this is interesting because, of course, we're looking for service pets, but it's very interesting what the ADA allows for what is to be a service pet versus what they call a comfort animal. And then people will put designations on their iguana or their monkey as a certified pet, you know, ADA pet. So have you experienced, I see a lot of smiles out there. I'm assuming that a lot of you have had experiences with this situation. So I'd love to hear one that would be maybe off the beaten chart, you know, maybe a small pony, something along those lines. Anybody have a good one to share with the group? I know you have them out there.
We've had a request for a parrot, but we turned that one down, but never the pony yet. So
Yes.
I've heard of that, but not had that one yet.
Yes, I come, you know, coming from California, we already had a lot of strange requests, and then going south, the animal numbers, and I'm not joking. So we've had ponies, chickens, iguanas, snakes, birds, of course, dogs and cats, and then large dogs that look like the size of a pony, monkeys, and my favorite one was what do they call it, a little potbelly pig. And now I'm an animal lover, so I love all animals, so I have a hard time, you know, discerning between that. However, our ridership out there typically does not, they're not as enthusiastic about these pets as the person bringing the pet. And I can assure you that the individual with the pet is very serious about traveling with that individual pet. Gloria, do you want to jump in there? Okay, I thought maybe there was going to be an additional comment on there. However, folks, your in-house program and supporting the ADA rights of those that do have properly anointed service animals is very important. I know a lot of transit systems avoid going further than asking the question of whether this is a certified service animal. I know during the application process for parrot, it's a lot easier to identify them up front, but I assure you out there in the fixed route world and on the light rail, they bring a wide variety. And I could also say that they bring a lot of other things too, like gas cans filled with gas and propane tanks and all kinds of strange items that makes our lives so much more bountiful when we're out there working our systems. So with that, this is what we're encouraging here, folks. We want them to think before you react and speak. That gray area in between when that action occurs is where we spend most of our time with the operators before they go into go mode. We want them to stop and think. John, you kind of covered that too, as far as being safe and secure. We take it to the extent as, can they come up with something to say that is relative to the discussion, and know your policy and procedure, because one thing that I noticed is that when people get excited or frustrated or assaulted or whatnot, they make bad decisions. Unfortunately, the bad decisions is out of a natural recourse. That's why training is so important in this position. Nothing worse than watching a video of one of your operators being assaulted and no one hit the panic button, no one called control center, and the client on the bus was only one of two clients, and the other client on the bus does nothing. You see where I'm going with this? No one is responding. No one is aware that this operator is being assaulted. And so basically what you have is an operator alone, possibly at night, in the workplace, who's being assaulted, and no one is aware of it. And this is what we're trying to discuss. I know there's the lighter side of these issues, but for those of you that work in an area where the possibility of assault is high, you need to be concerned about operator safety and security at that level. Okay, so let's talk about some of these things. Self-control, prevention, listening, adaptation rather, and thinking. What I encouraged during this course, and when I physically went out and restructured a lot of fixed route, para, and rail systems when it comes to assaults, whether it's operators or not. These are some of the items that I would hit on and train and practice with those individuals. Much like law enforcement and John, your experiences and my own, there's a lot of different decisions that you have to come through in that gray area of what you're going to do next. And law enforcement, has the benefit of having a distinct amount of training and a lot of interesting tools on their utility belt to make sure that they have different possibilities for different situations. Bus operators don't have that. Bus operators, in fact, don't really have anything. All they have is self-preservation, and by the skills that they're trained, and having a better than not good outcome. But I need to assure you that when I watched the videotape of that operator being slain at 30 miles an hour with a knife, the client did not come up sweating, did not come up screaming, did not use profanity in any way, did not confront the operator in any way, was minding their own business, and pretty much did it unannounced. So when we talk about a lot of these telltale signs, there's also situations while we'll talk about bus operator barriers and things of that nature, that there's a layered approach to how many different layers you need to ensure that they go home at night. This operator was basically given a Bolivian necktie, but the one thing that the client said before this happened was, "God bless you," and which the operator responded with the same, and then was murdered at this point. So even though we think that a lot of them are going to come with a spitting event, a punching event, maybe verbal event and whatnot, that's not necessarily true. I've seen a lot of different events that occur, and it's the extreme. But you have to be able to cover all these different items with your operators to ensure that they understand the types of events that they could possibly be exposed to, but you train them and you train them well. Let's just say we want to isolate those horrible cases to a minimum. All right. Warning signs. So under normal circumstances, we call this situational awareness. Military, law enforcement, fire, they all train on situational awareness, and that's to know the environment in which you're in. We need to read the indicators of passengers. You need to be mindful of your own stress. You need to be understanding the situation before you react. Maintaining self-control, being proactive. Why was situational awareness first understood and developed from fighter pilots? And it's because of the way that they do what they do in the air during an air fight. First developed and discussed with the Red Baron, and they wondered why he was still flying planes and he had been able to shoot down so many others. It's because he had an art in situational awareness. He knew what the opponent was going to do before they did it. And I know others are deeply trained in this event, but this is something that we could do and train our operators for free. So it's a mindset. Learn to predict the events. One is being situationally aware, of course. If you have an upset client come in, we're already looking to be proactive and to de-escalate the situation. 2, understand the elements. What if you were alone on the vehicle, and this is primarily to a fixed route sense? What if you had 9 juveniles get on and they're boisterous and being loud and obnoxious, and you've done nothing? You didn't say anything, they didn't pay their fare, and you just ignored it, hoping it would go away. And then also for John or those in para, what if you get a client that is obviously under duress, mentally unstable, might have been misusing prescription drugs, some of those things. And then basically, if you're the operator, you just ignore it. A lot of times we know what that means. You ignore it, and then boom, something bad happens. You didn't use any of your feelings. You didn't use any of your skills. Your gut was telling you that something's wrong, but you didn't take any action on it. Limit situational overload. Let's go back to all those teenagers that get on the bus. What can I do to limit that situation overload? Do I need to take off right then? Can I call my operations control and say, look, I got a possible volatile situation here. I have 6 to 8 juvenile individuals who are not behaving. Please give me guidance. Or should I wait in place for a supervisor to show up? So on and so forth. And the same thing for a paratransit operator, asking for assistance or guidance under that situation and maybe getting another level of control in place. Complacency is one of the biggest problems out there, because we see and handle so many clients in a given day. We get complacent day in, day out. It's like punching a time clock. We no longer see the cues. A lot of you know what a 30-yard stare is. 30-yard stare is where you're glooming out over the horizon. You don't know what you're looking at, nor does anybody else. And that happens in a lot of times with operators. This one is very difficult to train on, which is de-escalation. Speed, which means 1 minute you're talking to somebody on a very compliant level, which everybody is okay. And the next thing you know it, they're spitting in your face. And then the next thing you know it, they're trying to throw a blow. That's called escalation speed. That means how fast they're going to come at you, and the possibility of that. Law enforcement is trained heavily on escalation and keeping a safe distance and understanding what that means on how fast the situation can fall apart. Most people are not trained in this skill. And this is another skill that needs to be physically trained with the operators, depending on where they work and what the lines they work, and if you're in fixed route or not. Escalation of speed needs to be trained. I've trained hundreds of people in this. I can assure you that out of 100 people, the vast majority of them do not understand the escalation of speed, nor are they prepared to react to the escalation of speed. They do not know what to do. In fact, a lot of the operators, because they don't have the escape door and they don't have driver barriers up yet, they don't even know how to defend themselves in the driver's seat at all. So it's one of those things that we underestimate in our training program that needs to be evaluated. Fatigue. The more tired you get is more like driving under the influence, and the more your reaction time is slow, and the more your reaction time is poor. How many accidents have we seen of one of our vehicles rear-ending another vehicle, or one of our vehicles driving through a front yard, or one of our vehicles running over a bicyclist, or driving through a building? It's usually, not always, it's usually due to fatigue and or them using over-the-counter cold medicine and whatnot that wasn't previously disclosed. And I know most agencies, they want disclosed whether you're using over-the-counter or prescription, which should be discussed heavily. Because unfortunately, a lot of the operators out there are not disclosing any of the types of over-the-counter or narcotics that are being used. Don't stop. This program doesn't stop. When you do your first program like this and you train to your operators, your supervisors, frontline staff, mechanics, anyone that has a CDL or drives. This can't be a one-time deal. This has to be continuously trained because it's very tricky. As you know, our assaults nationally, again, are on the increase. They have not subsided. There's only tools that we could use to help curb them. All right, we already talked a little bit about this, about breathing, arms, body posture, eye contact, sweating, your fists are clenched, your hands are up in the air when you're talking and stuff of that nature. Signs and symptoms: alcohol and drugs, lack of coordination, focus, speech, motor skills, trembling hands. We've asked a lot of operators over the years why sometimes when they know that this person is heavily intoxicated, that they don't immediately call their, whatever their policy and procedure is, why they do not call in their operations control or supervisory staff to come over before they take off on their trip. And during their trip, the same individual then becomes combative or incoherent, goes unconscious, or starts a ruckus on the line. When this person is usually watched on the camera coming in through the door, where nothing's done with the individual and they're allowed to ride the line without further ado. We see that a little bit too often when it's fairly identifiable that this person is possibly intoxicated. Passengers with disabilities. Focus on the individual, not the disability. Speak directly to the person and their companion or interpreter if they have one. Assist the device. Well, all assist mobility devices are personal property extensions of that person. Ask before providing assistance, and don't be afraid to ask a question regarding their specific needs. What's interesting about the photograph, not totally out of the ordinary, but what's interesting about this particular photograph? Anyone? Now, you could probably notice that John, maybe you can answer this too. That type of wheelchair is heavy or light?
Heavy.
Heavy. John, how heavy do you think that wheelchair is, even without the client?
Well, probably 800 or 900 pounds or better.
And why? And when you say 800 or 900 pounds, you're basing that off of a particular item. What is that?
The motor.
Yeah, the motors and the batteries are extremely heavy. So
Right.
on this wheelchair lift, what do you guys think is the weight limit on that lift? Typically.
It looks like,
Typically, they're around
looking at that
800
lift,
pounds.
yeah, it looks like 8,000-pound lift there to me.
Okay, good. So you're let's say you're around 8. Looks like what, an old Gillett? Looks like a Gillett Phantom in this photograph. So let's say the wheelchair maybe is in the range of 700 to 800 pounds. And that client, as I was discussing earlier, is, let's say they're 250. So what are the consequences of not doing anything and just moving forward with this action? What is a consequence of go ahead and using that lift? What is one of the consequences right then and there?
I can see it not going all the way up and maybe going up in a jerking fashion, causing that wheelchair to come off that ramp.
There you go.
Because looking at that ramp, Steve, I don't see a back thing on it where it closes up behind those wheels once that rider gets on. I'm used to big Braun and Rikon lifts that when a wheelchair gets on and it starts to go up, that there's a lip that comes up behind that wheelchair to keep it from going backwards. And looking at that, that ramp, that looks like a ramp to one of our minivans, is what it looks like to me.
Well, John, it's appreciate you point that out. Back in the day when lifts were being used on buses that aren't so old, this is some of the hardware that was being developed. And, you know, this Phantoms were, I don't know, that Phantom could be 15 to 17 years old right here. But what I'm getting at is you'll notice that it is a lift. You notice that it's motorized and has batteries. You'll notice that the individual client in here may be at a certain weight limit. You'll notice that they have, what else on there? They have bags. You can only see the back bag. You don't know what's on her lap. You don't know what's on her left. That also makes it difficult to traverse and adds to the weight. Now, I'm not just talking from the safety and the security side, but I'm also talking about using common sense with the possibility of the ramp breaking, failing, and then the embarrassing moment of when it gets stuck half drift or where the person can't get off. You know, and keeping a mindful set of de-escalation, of just communicating with the client before this whole process starts. And there's nothing wrong with that, as long as they're using the policy and procedures that you have trained them on. How many times I've seen this fail, which is enough for me to put this slide inside this program. So just be mindful. And we'll come back to see if there's any further questions. Let's talk about the transient homeless population. And again, this is determinant on where you are providing your service. It says here 20-25% of the homeless population in the US suffers from severe mental illness. I would like to think that right now, most of you have, sorry, I have a frog in my throat. That most of you have experienced in some way or some form a client with a mental illness. And that's not necessarily just the concern. The concern is how many of you have very active programs in your training or in service that discusses the homeless population and the mentally ill. Now, a lot of those that provide special trips, whether you're in Call a Ride, paratransit, and those typically receive a fair amount of training. However, those in fixed route do not receive a fair amount of training in this area. Another reason why this slide's on here. Now, if you're in California, in certain parts of California, and if you're out on the East Coast, this number is higher. This number is not just 20 to 25%. It'll hit 40 to 50%. Depending on the service line and where you're located. So this is something that needs to be discussed with some of your mental health practitioners in your community that are willing to come to your bus operator class and conduct this part of the class for you. Or you could put together a special curriculum to have it handled accordingly. But we did notice a lack of training in this area on the fixed route side. Teenagers. Unfortunately, there's a lot of difficulties that have grown out of the teenager ridership. It may not be an overwhelming issue on the para side, but it's definitely getting more and more of an issue on the rail and on the fixed route. A lot of it stems around truancy. There's not a lot of truancy programs out there that affect or interline with bus service or with the different modes of service. How many of you can know and delineate a specific truancy program between the school, your local transit provider, and your truancy office, or if it's provided by your law enforcement? How many of you know right off the top of your head that there's an active truancy prevention program that coincides with all these different programs, and you know exactly who to talk to and who to call? Let's say it's 11 o'clock in the morning on a school day, a Wednesday, and they're all 14 years old. A lot of us in the transit industry don't know who to call. They don't know who to reach out to, and they don't know what to do. And for a lot of other systems, there's no program in place to address possible truancy issues. Now, teenagers can be a little tricky. They're a little bit more hot and cold. You talk to them in a normal manner, there's a good chance they'll speak to you back in a normal manner. However, the numbers have been telling us that that is on an increase over the years. that the number of truancy, the number of riders that are within that age group, and the more and more willingness for them to punch, spit, and then form a what we call a pack mentality, which is if
Right.
there's more than 2 or 3, teenagers are more apt to create a pack mentality. And then unfortunately, that operator or the clients on the line are subject to the pack. And you'll notice what's happening these days. Not only is it assault driven, but they're doing a lot of robberies. They're taking cell phones, they're taking headphones, they're taking purses. They're demanding for personal items, watches, wallets. They're doing smash and grabs, a lot of different things. So unfortunately, what you remember from teenagers, and we typically have a soft spot for them because we think of our kids, unfortunately, that's not what we're experiencing anymore these days. So we have to encourage the operators to be more vigilant around our teenage ridership. Does that make sense to everybody? Anybody have an active truancy prevention program that interlines with your services, that actively addresses this teenage ridership or possibly truancy during school hours? Anybody have that? And maybe that's something you would like to talk about in the future as we develop more programs to put out and whatnot. Is that something that people would want to even discuss, is how to interline your transit system with a transit truancy prevention program? So I'd be willing to take that into another course at some point. Elderly passengers, one of the most frequent item is our bus operators will yell at them. And I don't think they mean to yell, but they think that they can't hear. And they're not always very gracious in speaking with common terms. Sometimes they get overly excited when the client, who may be elderly, is moving slow. Another source of aggravation that the drivers sometimes discuss is that an elderly client will come up and want the lift or the ramp deployed because the kneeling bus doesn't make it low enough for them to step. We learn a lot of good attributes from those that work in the para side of the business, but unfortunately in the fixed route side, they're so used to on-time performance and being on time that sometimes they let their customer service fall. And it's common, and it's very common, unfortunately, with our elderly. I just always repeat, make sure you're treating them like your mom and dad. But there's a big curriculum that RTAP, if I'm not mistaken, RTAP typically isn't shared with the fixed route side, but there's a lot of neat things in the RTAP program that should be. Just my opinion. The art of diffusing, how can I assist you? I can appreciate, I'll do all that I can. I understand. These are words that we give to the operators because we want them to memorize those first openers. And we found it to be very effective. If we give them these, they're more apt to use these on a common basis. Okay, let's talk a little bit about Missouri. State title. In 2017, Missouri reclassified employees of mass transit as special victims. Same category as law enforcement and emergency personnel. A lot of those in transit, I found I've not been aware of this. Each state is not consistent. Please don't think that just because you have this and then you look into Ohio, Florida, Arizona, Washington, they're all a little bit different. There's a national program we'll talk in a second, but here's what it breaks down to be. First degree for a typical is a B. For us, it's an A. Second degree, it's a D. For us, it's a B. You'll notice everything is upgraded. And then fourth degree is a Class C misdemeanor, which is an A for us. Well, here's the tricky part. A lot of transit does not have their own law enforcement providing that security service on site. So what you're relying on is your local law enforcement jurisdictions to provide a certain service for you. And you needed to have a relationship with your law enforcement and your local prosecutor's office to understand that when the report is being done on a possible operator assault, one of you has to be involved from the onset of when the investigation starts, and you have to stay with it throughout the whole thing. Here's what typically happens in transit is that this assault occurs, the transit system takes the operator, puts them off duty, okay, with or without pay sometimes, lets them have a few days, brings them back to work, and assumes that law enforcement is going to not only use the special charge, but it's going to follow this all the way through the prosecution process. Doesn't happen. Doesn't happen that way, folks.
It doesn't.
I see John over there agreeing with me. It does not happen. You need to have someone from your agency who's willing to work with not only the operator, but that individual taking the report, and then those that are going to follow this through the prosecution process. This means that this can go on. Yes, sir. John, go ahead.
What we primarily see in today's world is that when something happens with transit or something happens on our bus, we get a young officer that really has no idea what's going on. And I hate to do this. I hate to throw the retired cop card out all the time, but that's what helps me get through these young men to understand that they need to do something to help us out.
Yes.
And I hate to play that card, but I do. That's one of the things that helps us gets a lot of these cases going is because I throw the retired cop card out. And they understand that I've been where they've been. So I can speak the language and understand what they're trying to say.
See, this is a key point as we have traveled and looked at a lot of different, now granted, I'm here at Metro in St. Louis, but prior to that, I did a lot of experience in following what happens when an operator was assaulted, anywhere from, let's say, a punching, and now spitting and projectiles, and then something a little bit more egregious. We found that typically there just was not enough follow through that would amount to, imagine yourself being the operator and you're at work in your office and you get punched. Why is that different any more than if you're at your office at work and one of your coworkers come over and punch you in the face? Think of it at that level. And when the operator finds out that this is not being followed through, and maybe all they got was 3 days off, and they were told to call EAP, think about how you would feel about returning to your work office if, one, something's not happening to protect them in the future or about what happened, and two, how that makes you feel of you being assaulted in the line of service and then no one doing anything about it. So it has a long-lasting effect.
I have a situation right now in our Midwest region where a passenger is cussed out, who is basically harassed. He is basically made threats, and he's pissed because one of the things is that the regional director of that region is a female. Our executive director is a female. He has no respect for females being in charge of an organization. And this guy, he doesn't know to quit. He's homeless. And I got the local police department working on it. I've asked them anything that I can do to help them get this guy to stop doing what he's doing. Because, back in my day, if somebody did that and I was working that case, he would be in jail right now.
Understood.
He would be in jail. And these, like I said, they take a report, they send it up to the prosecutor. They don't want to do on-view arrest anymore. They want to get the prosecutor to say, oh yeah, that's good, go ahead and arrest him.
Right.
Well, by that time, this guy's already continues his threats, continue his harassment. I mean, we had harassment just this last Thursday of him calling the office and cussing out our staff and leaving a voicemail of very hateful and calling names. So this is the problem I think that most transit agency or anybody deals with is that unless it's shots fired, unless it's somebody being robbed, they just don't handle it the same way.
Agreed.
So, I mean, I try to do everything I can on my part to get them to do whatever we can to get people like this in the system.
Understood.
But it's really hard. It's really
Thank you,
hard.
John. Appreciate that insight. Mike, did you have something, or Matthew?
Yeah, I was going to say our relationship here at CU has been fairly strong with the police department, and something that we continue to try to foster. Now, it helps that we are paying them their overtime rate at our transit center to watch it.
Yes, it does.
But we are getting more than that value out of that, because when they respond to accidents or they respond to incidents on bus, when we call 911, that helps us. Now, the thing that we learned, we appreciate Missouri. Our legal team has walked our most recent assault case. Unfortunately, we don't have many of them. The last one did happen in January, and our legal team here at the utility has walked us through this process. We learned an unfortunate thing in this process, though, is if the driver can't make the lineup, cannot pick the correct person out of a lineup, that assault is basically done. And that's exactly what happened to us in January. We even let him review the video. We got him the best pictures we could, which were all HD. He did not choose the right guy out of the lineup. And that was unfortunate. So all things considered, we appreciate Missouri's stance on this matter, but there's more to it.
And Matthew, I deal with police departments where there's a two-man chief and one officer to the Missouri State Highway Patrol. I deal with 87 different counties and law enforcement agencies all over the state. So what may happen in the Kansas City area or the St. Louis area is not what's going to happen in rural Missouri, where you got one officer that has no, training. So, I mean, this is what I have to deal with.
Absolutely.
This is what I deal with every day.
So to respond to both of you in some of a way, one of the ideas is that when the transit agency is performing some of their in-service training, they are encouraged to bring in their law enforcement partners at whatever level and to have a very deep and human discussion about the assault, the concern of assaults, how the assaults look. Show your bus operator shields, bring in the union representation, bring in a couple that have been assaulted in the past who are very well acclimated and versed to their career and what they do, and have a one-on-one so there's a face and a process that they can understand a little bit more. As you guys know, law enforcement's dealing with certain aspects out in the community. And this probably is not on the forefront of where they're just thinking of much. They might think it's drama or it's not that big of a deal, but at the end of the day, the level of incidences that have been occurring for assaults, not only in how many are happening, but on the escalated level, it's going on the unfortunate upward tick. So bring in those law enforcement with you when you do that training, so there's a little bit more of an understanding about what you're experiencing. And if you're lucky, get the prosecutor to join in, or someone from the prosecutor's office to come in and join you with that. Okay. National attention on the penalties. So let's talk a little bit about the national level. There's 31 states who provide specific penalties in connection with harming our employees. So it's the Transit Worker Pedestrian Protection Act. The bill authorizes $25 million per year for 5 years. So this is probably a couple years old now. So it provides for assault mitigation, infrastructure, technology. So they're talking about our barriers and some of the devices that go fixed on the bus for panic alarms. And it also provides for different camera capabilities. Again, I was talking about those live cameras and having the bandwidth to be able to jump into the bus and do what you do actively with sight and speaking capabilities. It assists with de-escalation training for bus operators. I have to say that we're very proud that Metro received a grant for approximately $175,000. It was received in January or February, I believe. No, I think it was February, but unfortunately COVID kind of threw us from a curveball, but we have it up and being discussed again. So we're excited about using these dollars for training on de-escalation and mental health awareness. So it's two prongs. We had a small match on that, so I think the total is about 2.25, but so it was about 175. Modifying the bus specifications and retrofits for visibility. There's a lot of discussions about the mirrors, the A-pillar, and then also the operator cockpit maybe being retrofitted as well, and then having escape doors or windows, things of that nature. Driver assistance, which is all your fancy new vehicles are coming out with collision avoidance. Everybody aware with that? And now they have devices for fixed route and pair of vehicles. And then retrofitting installation of bus driver seating and ergonomic, and reducing ergonomic injuries. EAP, I hope that all of you are vibrant in the use of the EAP. I encourage you to do an analysis of the use, not who uses it, but the use of your EAP program, and to see what the percentages are on at least an annual basis to see if that's being used. And then hopefully during the COVID, also that you've been utilizing mental health counselors and the use of your EAP program. Okay, let's talk a little bit about where we're headed. Make sure I leave just a minute for some questions. So there's a lot of discussion in these areas with transit safety and security. First one is your police presence. There's one thing to have police and security on your system. There's another to have police and security that are aware of their system. And there's one thing that says you have police who are aware of their system, who proactively secure your system. These are three totally different things. You could buy law enforcement security and put them on your system and still have problems on your system. And you could deploy them on your system and still have problems on your system because they might not be active. They may not be actively engaged in your system. They have to deploy with a proactive stance to make any difference on your system, on whether you're going to have it to be safe and secure. There's a lot of discussions on operator partitions. There's a lot of different manufacturers. There's a lot of different styles. I highly encourage you to not blindly go into bus operator barriers without understanding the type of vehicle that you use and who that manufacturer is building those, because I've seen them fall apart. I see them with glare. I see them impeding the right-hand mirror. I've seen all kinds of problems. So do your due diligence. One that is underestimated routinely is because we're too busy in transit is that we don't train, and we don't train enough. Training has to be the forefront in transit more than ever, and I'll tell you why. Our ridership has changed drastically. We have higher turnover in our rank and file than we've ever experienced in the past. And now we are using more we're using more difficult equipment these days. And what we're finding is that even though people get promoted sometimes within, they do not know how to use the equipment to which the level the equipment can accept. They do not know how to use all these different types like trapeze and the video systems and all. They use it to 30%. They don't use it to 90%. So we need to train also in those areas as well. Your violence prevention, unfortunately, should not just be your frontline staff. It should include all your staff, because as you know, there's more and more violence that occurs in a workshop and other areas in the office place than we experienced in the past, and so they get forgotten. So we have to use both sides of violence prevention. Cameras. They're only as good as you know how to use them. They're only as good as if you know how to maintain them. They're only as good as if you go out and clean them once in a while and you make sure that they're filming the areas that they're supposed to, and they're in alignment, and your system of whatever system you use is maintained. Quite frankly, a lot of systems that we go on there that have 8 to 12 different camera holds, we might find half of them in service. And out of those half, only 50% of those actually have a clear view of where we could actually use them in a law enforcement type case. So, and you know what I'm talking about. There's just too many cameras in our system that are not being used, and they're not being, they're being used after the fact. They've been produced more over the time to be reactive and not proactive. Because we don't pull tape unless we know that there's a reason to pull tape, right? So there's a whole thing now with the way that we want to develop our camera system. Remember, camera systems came out of operations. If you've been in this business for 10, 15, 20, 30 years, cameras were an operational piece. It had nothing to do with safety and security until more recently. And now the whole switch of camera use is for safety and security. Well, that means the paradigm between how you put your cameras out there have changed, right? And there's a lot of question as to how do you use cameras proactively if you're only pulling tape? Because they'll find out that when you use that and you have a high-end court case, they're going to ask you questions. Well, you tell me that you're using this for security purposes, but all you use them is for discipline. So whatever happened in non-discipline reporting and all these other types of things. So you got to be careful about how and why you use cameras. We underestimate automated announcements and the annunciators and the campaigns and the way we use our headboards and all this stuff. There's some good way to use good old-fashioned customer service with the operator speaking to the client in between the annunciators being utilized. You got to bring a little bit of the human factor back into the fact that someone's mom, dad, brother, sister, aunt, uncle, cousin is working behind the wheel of that vehicle. And they would like to know that someone's seen as a human and not just as a piece of equipment. One of the highest end discussions that we have with bus operators or operators in general when they voice their concern about dissatisfaction with their job is because they feel that their business unit doesn't appreciate them. Number one, they feel like a piece of equipment. So you got to bring a little bit of that human factor back. Prosecution, you absolutely need to have a detail, whether it's you or someone else at your agency that will follow through with the prosecution process. I tell you what, nothing goes more distance than following through with one of your assaulted operators all the way through the prosecution process and getting that closed if you're that lucky. That speaks volumes to your bus operator unit, to your para unit, to your light rail unit. It depends on who you are. By now, you're probably all experts in safety management systems. I hope you've taken the FTA courses and you've done all that work. And for those of you that are meet the guidelines of 100 more and all that other good stuff, that you're ready to meet the needs of the safety management systems and you've produced your PTASP. Everybody's done their PTASP, right? And if you haven't done one, even if you don't meet the funding guidelines or the pullout guidelines, I would still highly encourage you to produce your own agency safety plan that coincides with what SMS means. You may be able to get the state to assist with the building of those or maybe a partnership, but I encourage you to go through the process to build that agency safety plan because it's going to find all these issues and help you work on these, and it'll define your own program. You don't need to just to have the SSP and the SSPP and your emergency management plan and all these other things. Really seriously thinking about integrating this, no matter the agency size of doing this. You should have a post-assault program, and what that means is that that operator should be able to go through a post-assault program. It is not okay just to put them through three days off and maybe they call it EAP. You need to have a post-assault program in place so when that assault occurs, your operator has a place to go to understand and to better mitigate the long-term effects of assault. And lastly, I sure hope we're all using data analytics, technology, benchmarks, metrics to understand how to prevent and to assist with the safety and security program. I hope you have a data analyst somewhere in the bowels of your system, if not yourself, that is following your statistics, not just part 1 crime, part 2 crime, but you're also working with the TSA for your area, and you're also keeping the stats from your call log. However you keep that information on the inside, and you match all 4 components. You need to match all 4 to understand what your system is going through. All right, I cannot believe I actually landed at 12 o'clock, but normally this is an in-person course, and it takes usually anywhere from 3 to 4 hours. But we're here now, and I want to respect your time. It's 12 o'clock on the money. I am absolutely willing to answer some questions, but again, I respect everyone's time. If you'd like to ask a few questions, if not, I think my contact information is right here as well, and you're more than welcome to send me questions through my email, give me a call, or ask me any questions right now.
And we will keep it open for a little while in case anybody would like to ask questions. But if you have to go, we understand that too. So does anyone have questions for Steve?
What is your extension? Because I can't see it from our pictures.
2200.
2200. And that's SM Berry.
At Metro St. Louis.org.
Okay, .org.
Yes,
I can't see that.
We will also be sharing the slides and the recorded webinar here on our blog at MPTA, the MPTA website, mopublictransit.org. So you can look for that probably in the next 24 hours, probably be up tomorrow morning.
Okay, fair enough. So any questions for me? And again, I know it may not be the best time. It's lunchtime, plus there's so much going on with COVID. I understand that and appreciate that. You're more than welcome to reach out anytime. We could talk more. I can give you other experiences that we don't have time to discuss about, whether they came out from the west side of the world or the south, or what I've been experienced. I've only been at Metro St. Louis for about 9 months now. So I'm still experiencing the St. Louis region and all that. So by all means, I'm open book, but I'm very used to redesigning and building full complementary training programs. If you have any help questions, just let me know.
Hey, Steve.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned to have a post-assault program.
Yes.
Is there any, I would say maybe templates or anything that you know of to probably help give us a visual or idea how to get that started?
Yes, if you'd like, shoot me an email, and maybe what I could do is just put a couple attachments on there,
okay,
and see if that meets your needs, and if not, then we can kind of divide and conquer, or I could expand on it, and maybe we can groom it a little bit better for your particular need versus, a large metro versus a medium size versus a small.
Okay, appreciate that. Is that the same thing for as your, I guess they all tie, does that tie into also the safety management system that you were mentioning?
Post-assault, it doesn't really get covered very, very deeply in SMS. SMS is more of a system of 4 pillars of way to handle your overall agency. It's more of what I call it, an umbrella view.
Okay.
And then there's many different pillars that, and I can share you a link to a FTA training that you could do from the computer, so you get very acclimated with it.
Okay.
But because of 2000 and where they were with the acceptance of the PTASP, we are dead set now in transit that is accepting SMS. So we're never going away from it here on out. They've used it for many, many, many decades in airlines and in the military. And now they're saying, guess what, transit, you are now in the world of safety management systems. So we're just so lucky, right? Yet another program to take on. But it does make sense, and it's very worthwhile.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Anybody else questions? Okay, I think we'll wrap up then. I want to thank you so much, Steve, for being here and talking us through all this. I think I learned a lot.
Okay.
I think I can say the same for most of the other members here. And we appreciate your contact information. I'll share that as well if you don't mind. It'll be obviously in the slide as well. And great, and we will get that posted. And thank you again. And thank you everybody who was able to attend. And I hope everybody goes and has a great lunch, especially if you're working from home. I know that our chef here, I'm actually at the office, but my chef at home, which is me, has been doing a terrible job. But hopefully we'll get all through this together, right?
Yes. All right, very good.
All right. Thank you guys so much. Have a great day.
All right. Bye, everyone.
All right.